Last time we spoke about the victory at Leyte. In the Armagh Valley, General Kruger's forces pushed the Japanese into a retreat towards Polampan. As the Americans advanced, they faced entrenched enemy positions and challenging terrain. On Christmas Day, the 77th Division successfully captured Polampan, cutting off the Japanese main route. General Suzuki, forced to relocate his headquarters, prepared for a counteroffensive. Despite fierce resistance, the American troops continued to push forward, eliminating remaining Japanese units and securing strategic positions along the coast as the year closed. As General Eichelberger's 8th Army took command of Leyte Island, the 77th Division relieved other units in preparation for future operations. Meanwhile, American forces faced fierce resistance while securing strategic positions on Samar and Mindoro. Despite enemy air assaults, they successfully disrupted Japanese plans, including a failed counter-landing. Then over in Bougainville, Australian troops engaged in intense fighting, capturing Pearl Ridge after fierce battles. Their victory provided a crucial vantage point for future operations, marking a significant moment in the campaign. This episode is the Aitape-Wewak Campaign. Welcome back to the Pacific War Podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, the Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and my newly titled podcast, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released a new crazy story about Churchill getting drunk with FDR at the White House. As for Echoes of War, we are now looking into the Age of Antiquity, with a lot of episodes covering the Roman Republic. Now, if you'd like to support me further, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And hey, it's Christmas time, so you can always gift a Patreon account to a history-minded friend. As previously discussed, General Dunkel's task force successfully invaded Mindoro. Despite recent enemy efforts to reclaim control of the island, the Americans managed to establish airfields that enabled land-based aircraft to target specific locations on Luzon, while also safeguarding the assault and resupply of ships heading to Luzon Gulf. This location was chosen because it had direct access to Luzon's key military objective, the Central Plains Manila Bay region, and it featured the best and most extensive landing beaches on the island. While General Eichelberger's 8th Army was taking charge of Leyte and Mindoro, General Kruger's 6th Army was assigned to capture and secure a beachhead at Luzon Gulf, and then to advance south through the Central Plains to seize Manila and open Manila Bay. Furthermore, air and logistical bases would be established on Luzon to support future operations against Japan, and the legitimate government of the Philippines Commonwealth would be reinstated in its capital. For Operation Mike 1, the reconquest of Luzon Island, the Southwest Pacific's intelligence estimates concerning Japanese strengths, dispositions, capabilities, and intentions on Luzon were reasonably accurate from the start of the planning. The abundance of information must be attributed in a large measure to the efforts of guerrillas on Luzon, an island that was becoming a veritable hotbed of guerrilla resistance, both American-led and Filipino-led. Carefully nurtured by MacArthur's headquarters, especially after mid-1943, the guerrilla organizations had grown steadily in strength and effectiveness, not only as sabotage units, but also as valuable sources of information. The Leyte invasion in October of 1944 gave great encouragement to the guerrillas, who redoubled their efforts in preparation for the invasion of Luzon, which they realized could not be too far off. Throughout 1944, supplies of all types had been sent to the guerrillas, first by submarine, and later by airdrop and clandestine inter-island transportation. After the establishment of the Allied base at Leyte, the flow of supplies increased by leaps and bounds. The guerrillas themselves established a network of radio communications that soon came to be sustained and, to some extent, controlled by MacArthur's headquarters, which also sent into Luzon special intelligence parties to develop new sources of information and provide guerrilla efforts with more effective direction. In the end, one of the major difficulties the Southwest Pacific intelligence agencies had was not obtaining information from Luzon, but rather sifting through the plethora of guerrilla reports, which attained every conceivable degree of accuracy and detail. Once sifted, the information had to be evaluated and correlated with that received from other sources such as radio intercepts, captured documents, and prisoner interrogations. MacArthur allocated the majority of his army's ground combat and support forces, most of General Kenny's Allied Air Forces, and nearly all of Admiral Kinkaid's Allied Naval Forces, their ships and landing craft. For he needed to ensure enough forces were there to defeat a strong Japanese garrison, secure a beachhead against potential fierce resistance, advance south through the Central Plains, against expected strong defenses, defend the beachhead from anticipated counterattacks, and secure the Central Plains Manila Bay area within 4 to 6 weeks. Kruger was assigned command of the 1st Corps, which included the 6th and 43rd Divisions, as well as the 14th Corps, comprising the 37th and 40th Divisions. In reserve were the 25th Division, the 11th Airborne Division, the 158th Regiment, the 13th Armored Group, and the separate 6th Ranger Battalion. Supporting these units were 13 non-organic field artillery battalions of various calibers, 2 chemical motor battalions, 2 additional tank battalions, the majority of 5 engineer boat and shore regiments, 4 amphibious tractor battalions, and 16 engineer aviation battalions totaling approximately 203,000 personnel, of which 131,000 were classified as combat troops. Now actually, since I just mentioned one, for those who are curious, a chemical motor battalion were U.S. Army non-divisional units attached to infantry divisions during World War II. They were armed with 4.2-inch chemical mortars. Chemical shells were on standby during World War II to be used in retaliation should the enemy employ chemical weapons first. Toxic agents such as phosphine or mustard gas could be used as well as white phosphorus. Additionally, Eichelberger's 8th Army was tasked with conducting a subsidiary landing in Luzon with the 11th Corps, which included the 32nd Division and the separate 112th Cavalry and 503rd Parachute Regiments. Furthermore, MacArthur designated the 33rd and 41st Divisions as General Headquarters Reserve and made plans to send the 33rd and 38th Divisions, along with the 1st Cavalry Division and the 19th and 34th Regiments, to Luzon within 2 months. Kruger's plan for the Ligayan assault, set for January the 9th, involved an amphibious assault on the southern beaches of the Gulf, which were lightly defended but presented numerous obstacles that impeded maneuverability. Aiming for a swift landing with a robust force to achieve tactical surprise, Kruger opted for a broad front assault, with Major General Ina Swift's 1st Corps landing on the eastern beaches near San Fabian, and Major General Oscar Griswold's 14th Corps on the western beaches facing Ligayan Town. Each corps would land 2 divisions side by side, with 1 regiment from each division held in floating reserve. The initial missions of the 2 corps were the same: to capture the beachhead area within their designated zones, to protect the flanks of the 6th Army, to maintain communication with one another. Both corps were also ready to advance quickly inland to secure a crossing over the Agno River, which would serve as a starting point for the final push south towards Manila and Manila Bay. Anticipating some congestion on the beaches, Kruger decided to keep the 25th Division, the 158th Regiment, and the 13th Armored Group afloat until January the 11th. On that date, the 158th would land on the extreme left of the 1st Corps to block the coastal corridor along the eastern shore of the Gulf, preventing any Japanese counterattacks from the north. Similarly, the 25th Division and the 13th Armored Group would also be ready to deploy in Swift's area for both defensive and offensive operations. To facilitate the amphibious assault, Kinkaid took direct command of Task Force 77, which comprised the entire 7th Fleet, along with some Australian and Dutch vessels assigned to MacArthur, as well as warships borrowed from Admiral Nimitz' Pacific Ocean area. Kinkaid organized his Luzon attack force into several combat components, with Admiral Barbee's Task Force 78 tasked with landing the 1st Corps, and Admiral Wilkinson's Task Force 79 responsible for the 14th Corps. Admiral Oldendorf once again led the bombardment and fire support group, which included 6 battleships and 5 heavy cruisers, while Admiral Berkey headed the close covering group of 4 light cruisers. This time Kinkaid's escort carriers were under the command of Rear Admiral Calvin Durgan, who had a total of 17 escort carriers to provide convoy protection, conduct airstrikes on target areas alongside pre-assault minesweeping and bombardment, and to offer close air support for ground operations until that responsibility was handed over to Kenny's land-based aircraft. Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet would once again play a crucial role in the operation by targeting enemy airfields while also being ready to provide direct support if the Japanese gathered enough surface forces to initiate a significant naval confrontation. Meanwhile, Kenny's Allied Air Forces were tasked with safeguarding the convoy sides and rear through over-water reconnaissance and attacks on enemy facilities in the southern Philippines and Dutch East Indies, with General Whitehead's 5th Air Force responsible for carrying out most of these missions. Additionally, Army aircraft were to protect convoys traversing central Philippine waters and offer air support for ground operations whenever possible. To complement Operation Mike 1, a comprehensive deception strategy was in place, aimed at diverting the enemy's attention to a potential Allied threat against Formosa and southern Japan through naval activities in nearby waters. Consequently, Admiral McCain's Task Force 38 launched its initial strikes in support of the Ligon operation on January the 3rd and 4th. Although poor weather conditions hindered attacks on Formosa and the Ryukyu Islands, they still achieved moderate success. MacArthur also aimed to mislead the Japanese into believing that the primary focus of an Allied offensive on Luzon would be directed towards the western Batangas or the Bicol provinces. Therefore, on January the 1st, Company I of the 21st Regiment advanced on Bongabong along Mindoro's east coast, beginning the clearance of northeastern Mindoro. The next day, Company B of the 503rd Parachute Regiment started operations on the northwestern coast, moving towards Mamburao. On January the 3rd, Company K of the 21st Regiment landed without any opposition at Buena Vista, on the southwestern shore of Marinduque Island, and established positions to set up radar installations. Meanwhile, the other troops continued their advance towards Calapan, ultimately intercepting the recently landed enemy raiding unit on Pinamelian on January the 8th, compelling it to retreat back to Calapan. Although some Japanese forces managed to retreat to Manzanillo on the southeast coast of Mindoro and infiltrated overland towards San Jose, all attempts to raid enemy airfields were unsuccessful. Conversely, the 21st Regiment successfully captured Calapan on January the 24th, resulting in approximately 135 Japanese casualties, while the Americans secured the loss of a single soldier killed and 7 wounded. By the end of the month, Dunkel's forces had killed 170 Japanese and taken 15 prisoners, at the cost of 16 American soldiers killed, 71 wounded, and 4 missing, not including casualties from Japanese air attacks, which raised the Allied totals to 475 killed and 385 wounded. Looking back to Luzon, General Yamashita was also focused on finalizing plans and preparations to counter the impending enemy assault. During the later part of December, battle preparations proceeded with discouraging slowness. Overburdened transport facilities, enemy strafing and bombing attacks, guerrilla interference, and an acute shortage of automobile fuel impeded progress to every direction. On the other hand, there were numerous indications that General MacArthur was virtually ready to strike. In the Batangas area, enemy reconnaissance was conspicuously frequent, while the dropping of dummy parachutists and activity of small surface craft along the coast also caused grave alarm in the 8th Division. Other reports indicated that guerrilla forces were beginning to assemble in the mountains east of Manila, and that enemy submarines were delivering arms to guerrillas in the Limombe area. Yamashita accurately predicted that the invasion would occur between January the 10th and 20th, targeting either the Batangas area or the Ligon Gulf. However, recognizing that he lacked sufficient forces for a decisive battle, particularly given the decimation of Japanese air power and the enemy's air superiority, well, as of the 1st of December, the Japanese Army and Navy had probably just a combined air strength of 500 planes in the Philippines, the bulk of them based over at Luzon. This strength had been largely destroyed by Allied airstrikes in support of the Mindoro operation and during Japanese air attacks against Mindoro-bound convoys and the Mindoro beachhead area. By the 20th of December, the Japanese Naval Air Service in the Philippines had no more than 30 planes, and the Japanese Army Air Force was down to approximately 100 first-line combat aircraft. Thus, on that date, some 50 naval planes flew to Luzon from Formosa to renew attacks against Mindoro, and shortly thereafter, it appears, a few Army aircraft also came down from Formosa or the home islands to reinforce Luzon. Many of these planes were lost during continued attacks against Mindoro until, by the 31st of December, the Japanese had probably no more than 150 operational aircraft left on Luzon, and about a third that many on other fields in the Philippines archipelago, for a total of about 200. Thus, Yamashita planned to execute a coordinated delaying strategy, launching local counteroffensives only when conditions were favorable. This approach aimed to deplete enemy resources and buy valuable time to reinforce Japanese defenses in Formosa and the Ryukyus. Consequently, on December the 19th, Yamashita finalized a new operational outline that established 2 forces, one to cover northern Luzon and the other for central and southern Luzon. The plans outlined an initial strategy for the forces defending coastal regions to inflict significant damage on the enemy during their landing. This would be followed by delaying actions aimed at hindering the capture of crucial inland communication hubs and airfields. The final phase would involve a sustained last stand in the 3 mountainous areas previously identified as zones of the ultimate resistance. To delay further enemy operations against Formosa and the Ryukyus, Yamashita decided to strengthen the northern sector as its mountainous terrain and limited access routes from the central Luzon plain offered the best tactical conditions for prolonged resistance. As a result, southern Luzon would be nearly stripped of troops to reinforce the second largest concentration of forces in the mountains east of Manila. Yamashita positioned the 103rd Division in the Apari coastal area, with 3 batons stationed on the northwest coast. The 23rd Division, along with the 58th Independent Mixed Brigade, near the eastern shore of Ligayen Gulf, the 10th Division in San Jose, Umangan, and Natividad sectors, along with the 11th Independent Regiment at Baler and Digalan Bays. The 2nd Tank Division as a mobile unit in the Cabanatuan-San Miguel area, with the 6th Tank Regiment in Manila. The Manila Defense Force was responsible for Manila and the surrounding mountains, with a garrison on Corregidor and the 39th Regiment on the Bataan Peninsula. The 8th Division secured key communication points to the east and west of Lake Tail, as well as important coastal positions in the Batangas. The majority of the 105th Division would be stationed in the critical area east of Manila, while the Noguchi Detachment continued to hold Bicol, and the 82nd Brigade occupied coastal positions in the Lamon Bay region. Upon its arrival in Luzon, the 19th Division was tasked with gathering its main forces south of San Leon, while also deploying units to secure critical locations around Tuguegarao and Ucheque. Additionally, the 2nd Mobile Regiment and the newly landed 2nd Glider Regiment were ordered to bolster defenses in the Clark Field area, which were primarily protected by ground air units. However, by the end of the month, due to the slower than anticipated withdrawal of the 105th Division, Yamashita instructed the 8th Division to relocate its main forces to the region east of Manila, leaving only the 17th Regiment stationed in the Batangas province. Lieutenant General Yokoyama Shizue then took command of the Shimbu Group, which encompassed all forces in the southern half of Luzon, below a line approximately extending from Manila to Lamont Bay. However, that is going to be it for the Philippines today, as we now need to head over to the Aitape-Wewak region. Within the coastal sector, the 19th Brigade had moved forward in accordance with Stevens' orders of November the 26th, that should relieve the 2 and 7th Commando Squadron, clear the enemy from the area west of Danmap, and concentrate around Babang and Suan in preparation for operations east of the river. A company of the 2 and 4th Battalion had therefore relieved the 2 and 7th Squadron at Suan and Babang on the 29th and 30th of November. In the next 16 days, patrols clashed with small groups of Japanese on 7 occasions and killed 28 without a loss. By the 17th of December, the main body of the 2 and 4th Battalion was at Suan, with a company at Aitape-Bol and one at Babang. In the second week of December, the squadron expanded its control by establishing outposts at Yesil and Yambes, from which they successfully repelled several minor Japanese attacks. On December the 11th, an enemy patrol approached the perimeter held by Barnes' troops at Yambes. The Australians held their fire until the Japanese were 35 to 50 yards away. They killed 6 of them. There were patrol clashes that day on the 13th as well. At 1:30 a.m. on the 15th, an enemy force of at least 35 attacked. This time the Australians let the leading Japanese come within 3 yards of their perimeter, then they fired with automatic weapons and threw grenades. After pressing the attack for a while, the enemy withdrew, dragging away their wounded and about 10 dead. By mid-December, the Commandos had advanced along the coastal sector to Danmap, over 40 miles from Aitape and approximately 20 miles into the Torcaceles, without encountering significant enemy forces. The majority of Lieutenant General Manogoro's 41st Division was positioned south of Danmap, with the reinforced 237th Regiment under Major General Oatsuku Taro occupying forward positions between the Anum and Danmap rivers. Following the defeat of the Trinamore River, General Adichie's 18th Army implemented a strategy to minimize contact with the enemy. They positioned outpost forces for ambush and scattered their units across a broad area, especially in the locations where they could cultivate food and regain their strength. Despite these measures, many soldiers faced hunger, malnutrition, and illness. They often lacked essential modern equipment. Meanwhile, on December the 12th, Stevens instructed the seasoned 17th Brigade, led by Brigadier Murray Mountain, to relieve the 2 and 7th Squadron at Tong and to conduct patrols south towards Mimbiak and Yanatong, southeast to establish a base at Mizumbe, and east to set up a base at Mizu. Subsequently, the 2 and 7th Squadron was to relocate to Makur and to scout a route through Chem to the Danjirab River and Babang, aiming to establish a forward base at the Danmap, about 5 miles east of Makur. In line with this plan, Moen dispatched Major Ian McBride's Piper Force, consisting of 2 companies from the 2 and 5th Battalion, which arrived at Tong on December the 20th. That day, Major Good of the 2 and 7th Squadron reported that, except for foraging parties, the area which had been ordered to patrol had been cleared of the enemy. The squadron had killed 26 Japanese, lost 2 dead, with 5 wounded. Two attached Papuan police had also been wounded. The squadron's headquarters were now moved to Lambion, and they began a new task, to clear the Wallam area. Wallam village was occupied on December the 30th after clashes in which several Japanese were killed. Documents captured by the squadron that day indicated that the main enemy line of communication, from the coast to Bailiff, was via Wallam, Wamosis, and Wamsak. At the same time, Piper Force occupied Mizumbi and Masinao, coinciding with the arrival of the rest of the 2 and 5th Battalion in the Ambes area. Meanwhile, Stevens ordered the 19th Brigade to seize the Abomalin line to eliminate the enemy at Danmap. On December the 14th, Martin sent the majority of the 2 and 4th Battalion to cross the river, with one company successfully fighting through Lazy Creek to reach Rocky Point. As the other companies assembled, the 2 and 8th Battalion began its advance into the foothills to establish a forward base at Ida Kaibul and move towards Malin. Patrolling from Lazy Creek, the 2 and 11th had 2 sharp clashes with the enemy forces west of Nap on the 30th and 31st of December. 3 Australians and 11 Japanese would be killed. At Matapao village, early on the 2nd of January, from 30 to 35 Japanese attached to the perimeter of Captain Royce's company were hit hard by artillery, killing about 6 of them. This was the beginning of 5 days of sharp fighting between the Japanese, who seemed determined to stop the advance along the old German road. As soon as the enemy's attacks had been repulsed, Royce's company pushed forward along the road to a spur where the artillery observer, Captain Lovegrove, might direct his fire. A platoon crossed the Little Wakip River at 10:20 a.m., but came under fire from Japanese on the steep-sided spur. The infantry withdrew and accurate artillery fire was brought down. At 2:10 p.m., the spur was occupied, and from it Lovegrove directed fire on a pocket of Japanese so close that, quote, needed to almost whisper his orders into the phone. During that day, 14 Japanese were killed, 2 Australians were also killed, and 5 were wounded, of whom 4 would remain on duty. The next day, on the 4th and 5th, there was sharp fighting around the spur and towards Nap, and on the 6th, after a strike by 11 bombers and a bombardment by artillery, a platoon attacked across the Wakip, but was held by a resolute enemy pocket at Nap. On January the 7th, the Japanese defense was finally breached when 3 tanks broke through the beach and entered the town, followed by infantry. The next day, the leading company of the 2 and 8th Battalion entered Malin without facing any opposition. However, the 2 and 11th Battalion struggled to advance towards Dorito Bay, as the determined defenders repelled their attacks for another 10 days. On January the 18th, a company executed a successful flanking maneuver through the foothills to Nimbum Creek and eventually positioned itself south of Abu, capturing the town 2 days later. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Buttrose, man, that last name, it's kind of brutal. Sorry, audience, I'm immature. Had sent one company to assault Parambil and to secure the Muso area, while another advanced through Samul towards Maharingi, and McBride's company at Masinao moved eastwards to patrol deep into the south. On January the 3rd, the Australians unexpectedly drove a strong force of the 238th Regiment from Parambil, though they had to fend off several counterattacks in the following days. Continuing their advance, Asaling fell on January the 9th, followed by Samisei 2 days later. Another company secured Maharingi by January the 15th. But now it's time to return to the Marianas to prepare for the next missions of General Hansel's 21st Bomber Command. The American military took steps to improve Saipan's defenses after the damaging raids on November the 27th. In a frantic effort to detect future intruders, Admiral Hoover stationed 2 destroyers 100 miles northwest of Saipan to provide early radar warning, and an AN-TPS-3 radar was rushed to Saipan from Oahu by air. The destroyers in the same instances gave ample warning, but on other occasions, the enemy planes still managed to come through unannounced. Arnold became frustrated that the microwave early warning radar set still was not in use. On December the 3rd, Admiral Nimitz ordered that the highest priority be given to installing the radar. Despite this, it still was not ready until after the conclusion of the Japanese air campaign. 2 B-24 Liberator bombers fitted with air-to-air radar sets were also dispatched to Saipan. This was the first use of airborne warning and control aircraft by the United States, but they were not used in combat. To maintain pressure on the enemy following the San Antonio strikes, he conducted a night radar mission with 30 superfortresses on November the 29th, although it was unsuccessful. This mission was part of his preparations for a daylight attack on the Nakajima aircraft plant in Ota, scheduled for December the 3rd. By D-1, weather reports were forbidding. At bombing altitudes over Oda, winds were reaching velocities of over 80 miles per hour. At 1:30 on the 3rd, it was decided that the only hope for the day was to go back to Musashino, where visible bombing might be possible. Crews had already been briefed twice for the target. The 38th Wing hurriedly cut field orders, and by 9:45, 86 bombers were heading for Tokyo. 76 got to the city to find clear weather but high winds. 59 planes bombed visually from a mean altitude of just under 30,000 feet, and with poor results. Out of this mission, 6 bombers were lost, another 6 were damaged, resulting in just 26 bombs hitting the plant area, causing minimal damage to buildings and equipment. Once again, the strike was disappointing. Musashi's records indicate that 26 bombs fell in the plant area, while some small damage to buildings and equipment and almost none to the machinery was done. Japanese casualties were moderately high, though. Strike photos, the command's only source of information, seemed to show even less damage, and for those slight results, the command had paid very dearly, with 6 B-29s lost and 6 damaged. In response, on December the 7th, several Japanese aircraft, including 2 squadrons of Ki-67 bombers, launched a coordinated attack from both high and low altitudes, destroying 3 B-29s and damaging 23 others. This assault was observed by Lieutenant General Millard Harmon, the commander of the Army Air Forces in the Pacific, who had just been sent by Nimitz to coordinate an extensive attack on Iwo Jima's installations using both air and surface forces. On December the 8th, at 9:45, 28 P-38 swept over the island, followed at 11 o'clock by B-29s and at noon by Liberators. Hoover's cruisers began 70 minutes of shelling at about 3:47. The bomb load carried by the planes forcefully illustrated the difference in performance between the heavy and very heavy bomber. At 725 miles tactical radius, the 62 B-29s dropped 620 tons. The 102 B-24s only 194 tons. All told, enough metal was thrown to produce a good concentration on Iwo Jima's 8 square miles, but because the bombers had been forced to loose by radar, results so far as they could be judged from photography were handicapped, like the bombing, by adverse weather, much less decisive than was to be expected. Even so, the enemy's raids on Saipan would not be stopped until December the 25th. Although the results were not as decisive as hoped, the enemy raids on Saipan were temporarily halted. On December the 13th, Hansel sent 90 superfortresses to bomb the Mitsubishi aircraft engine works in Nagoya. The choice for the primary visual target was the Mitsubishi aircraft engine works at Nagoya, and the same company's aircraft works was named as radar target. Strays, it was hoped, would spill into crowded Nagoya City, Japan's second largest city and the industrial center of great importance. The engine works, still a top priority for the 21st Bomber Command, lay in the northeast section of Nagoya, at about 2.5 miles from Nagoya Castle. The plant was considered by the JTG as a single target, though it actually consisted of 3 separate but closely related units of a vast complex comprising the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. The first being the No. 2 Engine Works, responsible for research, design, and manufacture of prototypes. The second being the No. 4 Engine Works, which between 1939 to 1945 manufactured 44,004 engines, the most important model being the Ha-102, a 1,000-horsepower motor used on the Nick and Denai, and the No. 3, which was the No. 10 Engine Works, which furnished castings and forges for all Mitsubishi engine plants. On the 13th, the 37th Wing was able to get 90 bombers up, most of them carrying about 500-pound GPs, but 1 squadron from each group loaded with incendiary clusters as well. As on previous missions, a number of planes failed to reach the primary target. 16 B-29s aborted, and 3 bomb targets of opportunity. Japanese resistance was lively, but just 4 B-29s would be lost, with 31 damaged. Despite significant losses, the recent bombing campaign demonstrated improvement, resulting in the destruction of an assembly shop and 7 auxiliary buildings. Additionally, damage was inflicted on the assembly shop, a prototype engine manufacturing facility, 2 other shops, and 11 buildings, leading to approximately 351 casualties. The bombing, if less than pickle-barrel precision, showed improvement. Strike photos indicated that 16% of the bombs dropped had fallen within 1,000 feet of the aiming point, and that 17.8% of the roofed area had been destroyed. Although this in itself was encouraging, had intelligence officers been able to read from their photos the whole story, there would have been even more optimism on Saipan. At the No. 4 Engine Works, an assembly shop and 7 auxiliary buildings had been destroyed, and assembly shop and 11 buildings were damaged. At the No. 2 Engines Work, a prototype engine manufacturing shop and 2 other shops were damaged, and the personal losses ran up to about 246 killed with 105 injured. For For the first time, the 21st Bomber Command made a noticeable impact on the aircraft industry, prompting the Japanese to start relocating equipment to underground facilities. Plant officials calculated that the attack reduced productive capacity from about 1,600 to 1,200 engines per month. After December the 13th, parts were no longer machined at No. 4 Engine Works, and engine production was limited to assembly parts on hand and those received from other plants. Mitsubishi officials had been considering the advisability of dispersing the Nagoya facilities ever since the fall of Saipan. After the strike of December the 13th, the transfer of equipment to underground sites began. But even at the end of the war, the movement had not progressed far enough to allow for production in the new plants. 5 days later, Hansel dispatched 89 B-29s to target the Mitsubishi Aircraft Works in Nagoya. The Mitsubishi Aircraft Works was the giant assembly plant which used most of the engines produced in the No. 4 Engine Works. Located on a reclaimed land of the northeastern corner of Nagoya Harbor, it was, like the Engine Works, composed of 3 integrated plants. The No. 1 Airframe Works for research and experimental engineering, the No. 3 Airframe Works which built Navy planes like the Zero and Jack fighters and Betty bombers, and the No. 5 Airframe Works which manufactured bombers and reconnaissance and transport planes for the Army. Large, compact, and conspicuous, this complex offered an excellent visual target, and the proximity of the harbor shoreline made it suitable for radar strikes as well. On the 18th of December, the attack was performed, and as usual, it failed to follow the flight plan, resulting in only 63 planes bombing the primary target. Cloud cover was quite heavy, and 44 of these dropped by radar, to add considerably to the damage caused by an earthquake that happened on December the 7th. Though few bombs were plotted in the area, 17.8% of the roofed area appeared to have been destroyed. The No. 3 works suffered extensive damage to the sheet metal, heat treatment, fuselage assembly, and final assembly shops, and the No. 5, approximately 50% of the total assembly area was damaged. Casualties in dead and injured amounted to about 464. December the 22nd, Hansel was compelled to alter his tactics and initiate a daylight incendiary mission. Unfortunately, only 48 B-29s targeted Mitsubishi's engine works due to poor weather, resulting in minimal damage. The Nagoya mission on the next day, though using only incendiaries, was not in fulfillment of Nordstadt's request. It involved only 78 bombers dispatched instead of 100, and it was planned as a daylight precision attack. The weather turned bad, however, and before the last formations over Nagoya, the target was covered by about a 10 and 10 cloud. Only 48 planes bombed the Mitsubishi plant, and they had to be dropped by radar. Strike photos were few and revealed very little. Actually, there was not much damage to reveal. 252 firebombs fell into the area of the No. 4 works, damaging a few buildings but hurting no machine tools and causing no less damage to the production. On Christmas night, the newly renamed 6th Area Army, led by Lieutenant General Moto, launched its final significant assault against the Marianas, deploying 25 aircraft to bomb from both high and low altitude. This attack resulted in the destruction of 1 B-29, serious damage to 3 others, and minor damage to 11. Overall, the Japanese had deployed over 80 planes over Saipan and Tianjin, losing about 37, while managing to destroy 11 B-29s, seriously damaging 8, and causing minor damage to over 35. Finally, on December the 27th, Hansel's last mission involved a return trip to Nakajima, where only 39 of 72 dispatched B-29s caused little damage to Musashi's plant, although an incendiary attack unfortunately set a hospital on fire. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and my newly titled podcast, Echoes of War, on all major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, by this point, I hope my episode on Churchill getting drunk with FDR at the White House has come out. It's a bit of a comedic episode for the holidays. Also, over at Echoes of War, we just released a 3-part series on the Second Punic War, and an episode covering the evolution of the Roman Republic's military. Hey, and if you'd like to further support me, why don't you check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Joining either of these gets you access to the exclusive podcast, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. All of the funds from both are going straight to a new animator who's working on my series to finish off the Japanese invasion of North China, which I'm gonna just say it's been taking quite a while. I have been waiting on the animators on this one. But after that, we are going to be talking about all the conflicts of the 1930s, and it's going to get pretty heated up when I get to the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. It's going to be a banger. In a fierce battle for control, forces devised a strategy to defend coastal regions and key locations in Luzon. As troops repositioned, Australian commandos clashed with the Japanese units, achieving victories despite challenges. Meanwhile, American bombers targeted Japanese industrial sites, inflicting damage but facing heavy losses, marking a pivotal struggle in the Pacific theater.